Michael Thompson flashed that trademark grin at his lawyer as the divorce papers were signed, completely oblivious to what was coming. "Time to collect my share of the family fortune," he said loudly, making sure half the courtroom could hear him. His attorney actually laughed with him, like the two of them were sharing some private joke about taking candy from a baby. That's when I stood up from the gallery and walked toward the judge's bench, my sensible heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of inevitability. And if you're watching this, make sure you subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I'm Eleanor Whitman, 67 years old, and I've been waiting for long years for this exact moment. See, while Michael thought he was about to cash in on my family's hard-earned wealth, I was about to cash in on something far more valuable: justice. The envelope in my hand held a document that would turn his little victory lap into a perp walk. And honestly, I was enjoying every second of his ignorance. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was pounding. "Before any financial arrangements are finalized, I believe you need to examine the date on his signature." I handed the bailiff the envelope and watched Michael's confident expression flicker. With the first shadow of doubt, his lawyer stopped laughing. The judge opened the envelope and studied the contents for what felt like forever. I could see Michael shifting in his chair, finally sensing that something was off. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Michael waved him away. Still clinging to that cocky attitude, "Mr. Thompson," the judge said at last, his voice slicing through the room, "this appears to be your signature on a power of attorney document dated 2 weeks ago. However, according to the airline tickets and hotel receipts in this envelope, Mrs. Whitman was in London visiting her sister during that entire week." The color drained from Michael's face faster than water down a drain. His lawyer started frantically shuffling papers, clearly blindsided by what he was seeing. My daughter Sarah looked confused, but for the first time in months, she also looked hopeful. Furthermore, the judge continued, "This represents identity theft and fraud, both felony charges. The forged signature attempting to access Mrs. Whitman's financial accounts constitutes elder financial abuse." He looked up with the expression of a man who'd seen everything and was completely done with con artists. "Bailiff, arrest this man." The satisfaction I felt hearing those handcuffs click around Michael's wrists was better than winning the lottery. After 4 years of watching him manipulate my daughter and scheme to get his hands on money he never earned, watching his master plan collapse into criminal charges was absolutely delicious. As Michael was led away, still loudly insisting he was innocent, Sarah rushed to my side. But here's what Michael never knew about me: I hadn't just stumbled onto his latest scheme. I'd been building a case against him for 4 years, brick by methodical brick. This divorce hearing wasn't the end of his story. It was exactly where I'd planned for it to end. Let me take you back to how this whole mess started. Because Michael Thompson didn't just wander into our lives by accident. That man targeted my family with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. And I was the only one who saw it coming from day one 4 years ago. I was working part-time as a bookkeeper for Morrison & Associates, when a charming young man in an expensive suit walked into our office claiming he needed help with family estate planning. Red flags should have been waving like surrender banners. But my colleague Jana was immediately smitten with his smooth talk and designer cologne. Michael was 32, then handsome, in that overly polished way that practically screams too good to be true, and he had this uncanny ability to make everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. He said he worked in financial consulting, helping families protect their assets and plan for retirement. The irony of that statement would become painfully clear later during our consultation meetings. I watched him work the room, asking very specific questions about trust structures and asset protection strategies. What bothered me most was his intense interest in how power of attorney documents worked and what legal protections existed against elder financial abuse. "You know, Eleanor," he said after one particularly long meeting, "I'd love to discuss some investment opportunities with you sometime, maybe over coffee." I was 63 at the time, newly widowed after 35 years of marriage, and admittedly flattered by the attention of a younger man. But something about his smile reminded me of a door-to-door salesman who won't take no for an answer. I declined politely, citing professional boundaries, but Michael was persistent. He started showing up at the coffee shop where I grabbed my morning latte, always with some new chance encounter excuse. He casually mentioned that he was looking to settle down, to find a nice family to become part of, maybe someone with children who could use a stable male figure in their lives. That's when I realized he'd been researching me. Michael already knew I had a daughter named Sarah who was recently divorced and struggling as a single mother. He knew about my late husband's pension and the modest property investments I'd built over the years. And most disturbing of all, He knew I was the kind of mother who would do absolutely anything to make sure her child felt secure and happy. Sarah was 33 then, working double shifts as a nurse to support my two grandchildren after her first husband left her for someone younger. 10-year-old Jake and 8-year-old Emma barely saw their father anymore, and Sarah was exhausted from trying to be both mom and dad while keeping her career afloat. So when Michael suddenly started volunteering at the community center, where Sarah took the kids for after-school programs, I knew exactly what he was doing. Within 6 months, he had positioned himself as Sarah's knight in shining armor, helping with carpools, homework, you name it, while managing to learn everything he could about our family's financial situation. Sarah thought she'd found her perfect match. I knew she'd found her perfect predator. But Michael made one crucial mistake in all his careful planning. He underestimated the protective instincts of a mother who'd spent decades balancing books and spotting financial discrepancies for small businesses. I knew a con artist when I saw one, and I was already planning his downfall long before he even proposed to my daughter. The first time Michael brought Sarah to my house for Sunday dinner, I made my famous pot roast and watched him work his magic on my unsuspecting daughter. He complimented everything: my cooking, my garden, our family traditions, and played board games with Jake and Emma like he was auditioning for Father of the Year. Sarah glowed with a happiness I hadn't seen in her since before her first marriage crumbled. He held her hand during grace, helped clear the dishes without being asked, and even complimented the family photos on my mantle. To anyone else, he would have seemed like the perfect gentleman caller. But I was watching closely, and perfect gentlemen always make me nervous. While Sarah was in the kitchen helping me serve dessert, Michael excused himself to use the bathroom. Normal enough, except the bathroom was down the hall to the left, and I watched him slip into my home office on the right. A minute later, I casually followed him. There he was, photographing my bank statements and investment reports with his phone. "Michael," I said from the doorway, keeping my voice sweet as honey, "did you get lost?" He jumped like I'd caught him stealing silver. "Oh, Eleanor, yes, I was just. This is a lovely room. Very organized." He gestured awkwardly at my filing cabinets, pretending he'd been admiring my organizational skills instead of stealing my financial information. "Thank you," I said calmly. "I find good record keeping essential for protecting one's assets." I made sure to give the word protecting just enough weight to let him know I wasn't nearly as naive as he believed. "The bathroom is just down the hall, dear." That night, after Michael drove Sarah and the kids home, I sat in that same office and made a decision that would save my family for years later. If Michael Thompson thought he could charm his way into our lives and our bank accounts, he was about to learn that this grandmother had been protecting assets since before he learned how to lie convincingly. The next morning, I called my attorney, Richard Caldwell, who'd handled my family's legal affairs since my husband's death. "Richard, I need to create some comprehensive asset protection structures, and I need them to be completely bulletproof against fraud and manipulation. What's going on?" "Eleanor, this seems sudden. Let's just say I have concerns about a potential predator circling my family, and I want to make sure my daughter and grandchildren are protected." Richard spent the next 2 weeks creating a complex web of irrevocable trusts, multiple account structures, and fraud protection measures that made it virtually impossible for anyone to access the family's assets without extensive verification. Every major financial decision required approval from both Richard and my longtime bank manager, who'd known me for 15 years. Most importantly, Richard included clauses requiring in-person verification with multiple forms of identification for any changes to power of attorney or trust modifications. Any attempt to forge signatures or modify documents would automatically trigger fraud alerts and freeze the accounts until proper legal review could be completed. "This is extremely thorough," Richard said when we finished. "Are you sure you want this level of protection? It makes everything more complicated even for legitimate changes." "Richard, some things are worth the complication. If I'm right about this man, my family is going to need every protection we can put in place." 3 months later, Sarah announced her engagement to Michael Thompson. He'd proposed during a romantic weekend getaway, presenting her with a ring that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. When I asked how he could afford something that expensive on his supposed income as a financial consultant, Sarah got defensive and accused me of being negative about her happiness. "The wedding was beautiful, I'll give him that." Michael spared no expense on flowers, catering, and a photographer who captured every moment of what Sarah thought was the beginning of her fairy tale. I smiled through the ceremony, danced at the reception, and welcomed my new son-in-law with all the appropriate enthusiasm. But that night, I went home and started a detailed file documenting Michael's behavior patterns and financial inconsistencies. I had a feeling I'd need every piece of evidence I could collect. For the first 2 years of Sarah and Michael's marriage, I almost convinced myself I'd been wrong about him. He seemed genuinely devoted to Sarah, treated Jake and Emma like his own children, and even remembered my birthday with thoughtful gifts. He maintained steady employment with a legitimate investment firm, contributed to household expenses, and appeared to be settling into the role of responsible family man. Almost convinced myself. But a leopard doesn't change its spots, it just learns to hide them better. The first crack in Michael's perfect husband Fawad appeared during Christmas dinner in year 3. Sarah had invited me over for what she called a family financial planning discussion. Though the tone in her voice sounded more like an intervention, Michael sat at the head of the dining table like some self-appointed patriarch. A thick folder of documents was spread in front of him as he began explaining their concerns. About my financial management, Eleanor. We've been talking, and we think you might benefit from some professional guidance with your investment portfolio, he said, voice dripping with fake concern. Sarah mentioned that you've been handling everything yourself since Robert passed, and at your age, that's a lot of responsibility, especially for someone managing substantial assets alone. I sipped my eggnog and waited for the real pitch, because I knew this was heading somewhere very specific. Michael has wonderful connections in the industry, Sarah added eagerly. He could help you restructure things, maybe get better returns, and create a more secure estate plan for the family. How thoughtful, I replied. And what would this restructuring involve, exactly? Michael leaned forward with the excitement of a salesman who smells commission. Well, for starters, we'd want to consolidate your various accounts for better management efficiency. Transfer everything to a single firm where I have professional relationships. That could benefit you significantly. We could also modernize your estate planning documents. Some of those trust structures Richard created are unnecessarily complicated. For today's financial environment, there it was. After 3 years of playing the devoted son-in-law, Michael was finally making his move on the family assets. He wanted to consolidate my carefully protected accounts into a firm where he had connections, and he wanted to simplify the trust documents Richard had specifically designed to be fraud-resistant. That's quite generous of you, I said, keeping my grandmotherly tone even as my accountant brain calculated every angle. But I'm very satisfied with my current arrangements. Richard has been handling my affairs since Robert's death, and I trust his judgment completely. Michael's smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Of course, and I'm sure Richard is wonderful for basic needs. But Eleanor, you're talking about assets that could be performing much better with proper professional management. Don't you want to maximize what you're leaving for Sarah and the grandchildren? The guilt trip, a classic manipulation tactic, make the victim feel selfish for protecting their own assets, as though safeguarding them somehow harms their loved ones. I'd seen this exact strategy in the elder fraud prevention seminars I'd started attending. I appreciate your concern for my family's financial future, I said, setting down my glass with deliberate precision. But I'm curious, Michael, how do you know so much about my asset levels? I don't recall sharing any specific portfolio details with anyone. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Mom, we weren't trying to pry. It's just that Michael has experience with estate planning. And when I mentioned some of the financial discussions we've had, what financial discussions? I interrupted, my grandmother mask slipping just a bit. I don't recall having detailed conversations about my investment portfolio with you, Sarah. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Michael's face went carefully neutral, but I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Sarah looked confused and slightly embarrassed, like a child who'd accidentally admitted to eavesdropping on adult conversations. I may have noticed some paperwork when I was helping you organize last spring, Sarah said weakly. Paperwork about what specifically? I kept my voice gentle, but inside I was furious because I certainly didn't remember needing help with any financial organizing recently. Michael cleared his throat, clearly deciding it was time to take control. Eleanor, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Sarah and I are just trying to look out for your best interests as you get older. We're family, after all, family. The favorite word of manipulators when they want something they haven't earned. That night, I went home and called Richard first thing Monday morning to add even more security measures to all my accounts. 2 days after that uncomfortable Christmas dinner, I did something I never imagined doing in my 66 years. I hired a private investigator. Not because I enjoyed being suspicious of my son-in-law, but because protecting my family meant knowing exactly what kind of man had married into it. Patricia Morgan came highly recommended by Richard's law firm. She specialized in background investigations and financial fraud cases. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd spent 15 years in law enforcement before going private. And she had the kind of sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. "What exactly are you looking for, Mrs. Whitman?" Patricia asked during our first meeting in her downtown office. "The truth about Michael Thompson," I replied. "I have strong suspicions about his character and intentions, but I need facts before I can protect my family properly." Patricia's preliminary report arrived just 10 days later, and it was worse than even my suspicious mind had imagined. Michael Thompson wasn't just a garden variety gold digger. He was a calculated fraud artist with a documented pattern of targeting older women and their families. His employment history was a masterpiece of exaggeration and omission. His so-called financial consulting work consisted of short-term jobs at various firms, usually ending when supervisors discovered discrepancies in client account handling or inappropriate access to confidential information. He'd been terminated from 3 different companies for policy violations related to client confidentiality breaches. But his relationship history was even more disturbing. Patricia found evidence of 2 previous serious relationships with single mothers who had family money or valuable assets. Both relationships ended badly, with the women reporting suspicious financial activity and missing documents. After Michael moved out, the first woman, Catherine Mills from Ohio, dated him for 8 months. During that time, she experienced identity theft that drained her savings and maxed out her credit cards. The theft occurred just 2 weeks after she gave Michael a key to her apartment for emergencies. The second woman, Jana Rodriguez from Kentucky, had been engaged to Michael for 6 months. She later discovered he'd been using her personal information to apply for credit cards and loans in her name. By the time she figured out what was happening, Michael had disappeared, leaving her with over $40,000 in debt she didn't create. Mrs. Whitman, Patricia said when she called to discuss the report, "This man follows a consistent pattern. He targets women with children and assets, builds trust, then gradually gains access to financial information before committing fraud. The fact that he's been married to your daughter for 3 years suggests she's his biggest target yet." The most chilling part was Michael's methodical approach to gathering information. Both previous victims reported that he'd shown unusual interest in their family financial arrangements, estate documents, and banking relationships. He volunteered to help with paperwork, offered financial advice, and slowly positioned himself as someone who should be trusted with sensitive information. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at Patricia's report and feeling sick about what this meant for Sarah and my grandchildren. Michael hadn't just fallen in love with my daughter, he'd studied our family for years, learned our vulnerabilities, and planned his approach to our assets. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Michael or trying to convince Sarah of his true nature, I was going to let him make his move, while ensuring he walked straight into a legal trap that would destroy him. I called Richard and asked him to prepare additional fraud prevention measures that would activate the moment Michael attempted any unauthorized access to my accounts. Every document would be protected with multiple verification requirements, and any attempt at forgery would automatically generate evidence for criminal prosecution. "Eleanor, you're essentially building a financial fortress," Richard said after reviewing my instructions. "Are you absolutely certain this level of preparation is necessary?" "Richard, I'm about to let a predator think he's found easy prey. I want to make sure that when he strikes, he destroys himself in the process." 6 months later, Patricia called with news that made my blood run cold. Michael had been making inquiries about my financial accounts, using Sarah's name and their relationship to try to obtain information from my bank and investment firm. He was finally ready to make his move, and I was more than ready to spring my trap. The morning that changed everything began with Sarah calling me at 6 a.m., her voice shaking with a mix of fury and humiliation. I was in my kitchen making coffee when the phone rang, and from her tone alone I knew my 4-year wait was finally over. "Mom, I need you to come over right now and bring Richard if you can reach him. Something terrible has happened." When I arrived at Sarah's house an hour later with Richard in tow, we found her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents and looking like she'd been hit by a truck. But there was something in her expression I hadn't seen in years, the fierce determination she'd inherited from me. "He's been lying to me about everything," Sarah said without preamble. "Michael's been using fake employment records, false references, and stolen identities. I found bank statements showing deposits that don't match his claimed salary, and credit card bills for expenses I never authorized." Richard examined the documents with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent decades studying financial fraud. "Sarah, how did you discover all this?" "I got suspicious when he started pressuring me about Mom's finances," she replied, gesturing toward a stack of papers. "So I hired someone to do a background check on my own husband. Turns out Michael Thompson barely exists legally. His social security number belongs to someone who died 5 years ago. A cold satisfaction settled in my chest. After 4 years of watching and waiting, Michael had finally overplayed his hand enough for Sarah to see through him. There's more, Sarah said, her voice hardening. I found forged power of attorney documents in his desk drawer. He's been planning to gain control of your accounts. Mom, the signatures look like yours, but they're dated from last week when you were visiting Aunt Margaret in London. Richard studied the forged documents with growing amazement. These are sophisticated forgeries, but they have several legal flaws that would make them worthless in court. More importantly, attempting to use forged documents to access someone else's financial accounts is multiple felonies. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia, asking her to bring copies of her investigative report to Sarah's house immediately. When she arrived 30 minutes later, we spread her findings across the dining room table like evidence in a criminal trial. Michael has been running the same con for years. Patricia explained to Sarah, you're actually the longest relationship he's maintained, which suggests he saw your family as his biggest potential score. Sarah stared at the evidence of Michael's other victims with growing horror. Those poor women. And I defended him to you, Mom. I actually got angry at you for being suspicious of him. You wanted to believe in love and second chances, I said gently. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem was that Michael was never offering either of those things honestly. Richard was studying the forged power of attorney documents with renewed interest. Eleanor, these forgeries give us everything we need to file criminal charges. Identity theft, attempted fraud, forgery. We're looking at multiple felonies with clear intent to commit elder financial abuse. Good, Sarah said, her voice hard as steel. I want him prosecuted for everything he's done to me. To those other women, to our entire family. That afternoon, we walked into the police station together, a grandmother who'd spent for years building a trap, a daughter who'd finally seen through a master manipulator's lies, and a lawyer with enough evidence to put a career criminal behind bars where he belonged. Detective Morrison took our statement and said it was one of the most well-documented fraud cases he'd ever seen. Mrs. Whitman, your financial protections prevented any actual loss, but the attempted fraud is more than enough for serious criminal charges. But as satisfying as filing those charges felt, I knew the real confrontation was still coming. Michael would have to come home eventually, and when he did, he'd find a very different reception than he was expecting, because after 4 years of patient preparation, this grandmother was finally ready to spring her trap and watch a predator destroy himself completely. Michael walked into his house that evening expecting to find his usual welcoming committee. Sarah making dinner, the kids doing homework, and domestic bliss covering up his carefully orchestrated con. Instead, he found 3 adults sitting in his living room like a tribunal of justice, surrounded by evidence of his fraudulent life spread across the coffee table like a poker hand he couldn't bluff his way out of. The look on his face when he saw all those documents was absolutely priceless. Pure panic, followed by the rapid mental calculation of someone trying to figure out which lie to tell first. His eyes darted from the forged power of attorney to the background investigation reports, then to Sarah's tear-stained but determined face. Sarah, honey, what's going on here? He asked, setting down his briefcase with the careful movements of someone approaching a ticking bomb. Why is everyone looking so serious? Michael Thompson, I said, my voice sweet as honey but sharp as steel. Or should I say Michael Patterson? It's getting hard to keep track of which identity you're using to commit fraud this week. Sarah stood up, and I'd never been prouder of my daughter's backbone. Don't even think about lying to me anymore, Michael. I know about the forged documents. I know about Catherine Mills and John A. Rodriguez. And I know about what you tried to do to my mother. Michael's charming facade cracked completely. The warm smile disappeared, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with here, Sarah. Your mother is a paranoid old woman who's been sabotaging our marriage from day one, because she can't stand seeing you happy. Excuse me, I said, standing up and facing him directly. I'm paranoid. That's rich coming from a man who's been photographing my financial documents and forging my signature to steal my life savings. That's not what happened, oh. But it is exactly what happened, I continued, enjoying the way his face went pale. Did you really think I didn't notice you snooping through my office during your first visit? Did you think I was just some doddering grandmother who wouldn't recognize a con artist when I saw one? Michael's strategy shifted to aggressive denial, probably his last-ditch effort to regain control. These are all misunderstandings, paperwork errors. You're making me sound like some kind of criminal over simple mistakes. Richard cleared his throat and held up the forged power of attorney documents. Michael, these aren't paperwork errors. These are felony forgeries with clear intent to defraud a senior citizen. The penalties for elder financial abuse in this state are quite severe. My legal situation? Michael laughed, but it sounded forced and desperate. What legal situation? You can't prove criminal intent from some disputed signatures. Richard smiled the way a chess master smiles when announcing checkmate. Actually, we can prove intent quite easily. You see, Eleanor was in London visiting family when you allegedly witnessed her signing these documents. We have passport stamps, hotel receipts, and restaurant bills proving she was 3,000 miles away from your supposed notary appointment. The reality of his situation finally seemed to sink in. Michael looked around the room like a trapped animal, calculating escape routes and finding none. This is all circumstantial. You can't prove I forged anything, actually, Patricia said, opening another folder. Your signature patterns are remarkably consistent across multiple fraud attempts. I've been in touch with Catherine Mills and John A. Rodriguez. They're both very interested in pressing charges for what you did to them as well. Michael's last thread of composure snapped completely. Those women knew exactly what they were getting into. They were willing participants in everything that happened. The admission hung in the air like a confession written in neon. Sarah closed her eyes, probably processing the reality that she'd been married to a man who saw vulnerable women as willing victims of his financial schemes. Well, I said, straightening my cardigan with satisfaction, I think we've heard enough, Richard. Shall we proceed with filing those charges? Wait, Michael said desperately. Sarah, think about this. We have a good life together. I love you and the kids. Don't let your mother destroy our family over some business disagreements. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant when her last fragment of love for him died completely. You destroyed our family the moment you decided to use us as pawns in your con game. Michael, I'm just brave enough to admit it's over. 2 days after our confrontation with Michael, Detective Morrison called with news that made my methodical planning feel even more justified. What we'd uncovered wasn't just an isolated case of attempted fraud. It was part of a pattern that had been damaging families across 3 states for nearly a decade. Mrs. Whitman, I need you and your daughter to come in for a follow-up interview, Detective Morrison said. We've been in contact with authorities in Ohio and Kentucky, and this case has some elements that require coordinated prosecution efforts. What kind of elements? I asked, though honestly, nothing about Michael could surprise me anymore. Multiple victims, interstate fraud, and what appears to be a systematic approach to targeting specific types of families. Your son-in-law has been very busy over the years. Sarah and I arrived at the police station the next morning to find Detective Morrison waiting with Detective Lisa Chen from the Financial Crimes Unit. The conference room table was covered with files, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of Michael's criminal career. Extensive, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Mrs. Whitman. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Chen began. We've been working with law enforcement in other states to build a comprehensive case against Michael Patterson. What you've provided has helped us connect several previously unrelated fraud investigations. How many other families has he targeted? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 confirmed cases over the past 8 years. Detective Morrison replied. Each case follows the same pattern. He targets single mothers or widows with assets, builds long-term relationships, then attempts financial fraud once he's gained their trust. The scope of Michael's deception was staggering but also grimly predictable. For 8 years he'd been refining his approach, learning from each victim, adjusting his methods, becoming more sophisticated as he went. The good news, Detective Chen continued, is that your legal protections prevented any actual financial loss, Mrs. Whitman. But more importantly, your documentation of his behavior has helped us understand his methods and build cases for his other victims. What about the other women he hurt? I asked, will they get justice too? Detective Morrison checked his notes. Catherine Mills lost $43,000 to identity theft after dating Michael. John A. Rodriguez accumulated $67,000 in fraudulent debt. We have 3 other victims with similar losses totaling over $200,000. My God, Sarah whispered. $200,000 stolen from women who trusted him. The pattern is always the same. Detective Chen explained. He gains access to personal information, gradually establishes financial dependency or control, then executes fraud just before disappearing from their lives. Your family would have been his largest single target. I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that my 4 years of preparation hadn't just protected my family, they had given law enforcement exactly what they needed to seek justice for every woman he'd hurt. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we coordinate with prosecutors in multiple states to make sure Michael faces charges for everything he's done, Detective Morrison replied. grand larceny, identity theft, elder fraud, forgery were looking at significant prison time across multiple jurisdictions. As we left the police station that afternoon, I couldn't help feeling vindicated. What I'd once believed was just paranoid overprotection had turned out to be the perfect trap. For a career criminal, Mom, Sarah said as we walked to our cars, I owe you an apology. You were right about Michael from the very beginning, and I should have listened to you. Sweetheart, you wanted to believe in love and second chances. That's not something to apologize for. The problem was that Michael was never offering either of those things honestly. But I was proud that my daughter had found the strength to see through his manipulation and fight back. Sometimes the best gift you can give your children is teaching them they're worth protecting, even if it takes years for them to understand the lesson. The weeks leading up to Michael's trial were like watching dominoes fall in a carefully arranged pattern, except each falling piece revealed another victim whose life he'd systematically destroyed. Detective Morrison called regularly with updates that made me grateful for every suspicious precaution I'd taken over the past 4 years. The investigation had expanded to include fraud cases in Ohio, Kentucky, and Florida. Michael's methods were remarkably consistent: identify vulnerable women with assets, build romantic relationships over months or years, gain access to financial information, then execute identity theft and fraud before disappearing with their life savings. Mrs. Whitman, Detective Chen explained during one of our meetings, we found evidence of at least 9 separate victims spanning back 12 years. The total estimated theft is over $400,000. Sarah took the news about Michael's extended criminal history particularly hard. I still can't believe I lived with a man who was quietly destroying other families while pretending to love ours. How did I miss every sign? What he did went so much deeper than financial fraud. Michael weaponized trust itself, twisting people's basic desire for love and partnership into a tool for exploitation. Every romantic gesture had been calculated. Every family moment had been a performance meant to lower our defenses. And if Michael thought his growing legal troubles would make me feel sorry for him, he was about to learn otherwise. Whatever sympathy I'd once had was drained years ago. He'd spent for years treating my family like marks in one long con. And now he was finally facing the consequences of underestimating women who refused to be victims. Patricia called with an update that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Eleanor, you're going to love this. Michael's previous victims have been comparing notes, and they're organizing a coordinated effort to make sure he faces the maximum penalties. The prosecutors are thrilled to have such cooperative witnesses. How are the other women doing? I asked. Better than you might expect. Catherine Mills has rebuilt her savings and started a support group for fraud victims. And Jana Rodriguez used her experience to become a consumer protection advocate. They're both stronger for having survived him, and they're determined to make sure he never hurts anyone else. The preliminary hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late October. Sarah and I arrived at the courthouse to find a remarkable gathering of Michael's victims, women from 30 to 71, each wearing the same expression of determined justice I'd been carrying for months. Catherine Mills, a dignified woman in her 60s, had dedicated her retirement to helping other seniors avoid financial scams. When we were introduced, she said, Mrs. Whitman, thank you for finally catching this predator. I knew he was a thief, but I never imagined the scope of what he was doing. Jana Rodriguez brought her adult daughter for support. Both of them looked like they'd gladly serve on a firing squad. If it meant putting Michael away for good, that man didn't just steal money from me, Jana said. He stole my ability to trust people. I'm here to make sure he pays for every family he's destroyed. Looking around at the room full of women Michael had underestimated, I felt a fierce pride in our collective strength. He targeted us thinking we were easy prey, isolated women who would be too embarrassed or confused to fight back. Instead, he'd created an army of highly motivated prosecutors who'd spent years documenting his crimes and building airtight cases against him. Michael's preliminary hearing lasted exactly 23 minutes. His court-appointed lawyer entered a plea of not guilty to everything, but the judge set his bail so high that Michael's face went pale. As officers led him back to his cell, he noticed us sitting in the gallery. The look he gave us was pure hatred mixed with disbelief. After years of successful manipulation, he still couldn't comprehend how his foolproof con had turned into a multi-state prosecution, with victims joining forces against him. See you at trial, Michael, I called sweetly as the bailiff escorted him away. 2 weeks before the trial, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She filed a civil lawsuit against Michael for fraud, emotional distress, and financial damages. She wanted restitution not only for our family, but for all the victims who might never fully recover what he stole. I want to make sure he can never profit from what he's done. Sarah explained as we sat in Richard's office reviewing the civil complaint. Even if he serves prison time, I don't want him getting out and starting over with some new victim. Richard had been working with prosecutors and victim advocates to build a comprehensive strategy addressing both criminal justice and financial recovery. Sarah, he said, this civil action could lead to permanent liens on any assets Michael has hidden, plus garnishment of future earnings. It's an excellent long-term protection strategy. Civil discovery had already uncovered assets Michael had tucked away in various accounts under different names. He'd been more successful than any of us realized. Over $200,000 accumulated through years of fraud, money that truly belonged to the women he'd stolen it from. The beauty of filing civil charges alongside criminal ones, Richard explained, is that even if Michael tries to hide assets or declare bankruptcy, the fraud judgments will follow him for the rest of his life. 3 days before the trial, Detective Morrison called with final updates that felt almost like divine intervention. The prosecution had built such a strong, detailed case that Michael's attorney was now trying to negotiate a plea deal, just to avoid going to trial. What kind of plea deal? I asked, though part of me hoped the answer would be none at all. 25 years in state prison, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibitions against access to financial services or employment in any position involving trust or financial responsibility, Detective Morrison said. The prosecutor is inclined to accept because it guarantees justice, without putting the victims through a difficult trial. Sarah and I talked about the plea offer at length. A part of me craved the satisfaction of watching Michael face a jury and hearing every detail of his crimes read aloud in open court. But the practical side of me knew that a guaranteed 25-year sentence would protect future victims and ensure he spent the most productive years of his life behind bars. I think we should accept the plea, Sarah said finally. I don't need to hear him make excuses or try to manipulate a jury. I just want him gone from our lives permanently. The plea hearing was set for a gray Monday morning in November. Michael sat at the defendant's table looking like someone who finally realized his charm and manipulation meant nothing against solid evidence and united victims. When the judge asked if he understood the charges and their consequences, Michael's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. And do you admit guilt to the charges of grand larceny, identity theft, elder fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across multiple jurisdictions? Michael glanced back at our group sitting in the gallery, his expression a mix of defeat and lingering resentment. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's sentencing was swift and thorough. 25 years in state prison, $437,000 in restitution to his victims, and lifetime restrictions on financial employment or access to other people's personal information. As the bailiff led Michael away in shackles, he didn't look back at us. His career as a professional predator was truly over, and he would spend the next quarter-century learning what it felt like to be powerless in a world where charm and manipulation were worthless currencies. 6 months after Michael's sentencing, I received a letter that brought an unexpected sense of closure to our 4-year ordeal. It was from Catherine Mills, the first woman Michael had defrauded, and it contained news that made all my years of cautious preparation feel like divine providence. Dear Eleanor, the letter began. I wanted you to know that the restitution fund has been distributed to all of Michael's victims, thanks to your civil lawsuit and the asset recovery efforts. Every woman he stole from has received full compensation for their losses. Catherine explained that the recovered money, along with the assets Michael had purchased with stolen funds, had created a victim compensation fund far exceeding anyone's expectations. Each woman defrauded would receive not only her original losses, but additional compensation for emotional distress and financial hardship. Even more meaningful, Catherine had used her experience to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating older adults about financial fraud and romance scams. Michael taught us all painful lessons about trust and vulnerability, she wrote. But we've turned those lessons into tools for protecting other families from predators like him. Sarah and I were invited to the organization's first annual conference, where fraud survivors shared their stories and law enforcement officials taught strategies for recognizing and preventing financial exploitation. Standing in a room full of strong women who refused to let one man's cruelty define their futures, I felt deep pride in what we had accomplished together, Mom, Sarah said as we listened to Jana Rodriguez talk about her advocacy work. I've been thinking about what Michael said in court, that there are others like him, and we'll never see them coming. What about it? I asked. I think he's wrong. We've all learned to see the signs now. We know what to look for, how to protect ourselves, and most importantly, we know we're worth protecting. The conference organizers asked me to speak about financial protection strategies for older adults. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of survivors and their families, I felt the weight of our shared experience and the strength of our collective knowledge. 4 years ago, I began. I thought I was just being a paranoid grandmother when I built legal protections against a son-in-law I didn't trust. Today, I know I was acting on instincts that had been developed over decades of watching people and recognizing patterns that didn't make sense. I talked about the importance of trusting those instincts, even when family members dismiss concerns as paranoia or negativity. I shared practical strategies for protecting assets and personal information, and I emphasized that no one should ever feel guilty for being cautious about financial security. Michael Thompson taught our families a valuable lesson, I concluded. He taught us that predators rely on our politeness, our desire to trust, and our reluctance to seem suspicious. But he also taught us that careful preparation and refusing to be victimized can turn the tables on even the most sophisticated con artist. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the letter I'd written to my late husband's memory 4 years earlier, promising to protect our family from the predator who'd married our daughter. Robert would have been proud to know that our granddaughter Sarah had found the strength to fight back, and that our careful financial planning had helped bring justice to families across multiple states. The house felt peaceful that night in a way it hadn't since Michael first walked into our lives. My financial protections were still in place, but they no longer felt like fortress walls against unknown threats. They felt like reasonable precautions taken by a woman who'd learned to value her own security and the safety of the people she loved. Michael was serving the third year of his 25-year sentence, and according to prison records, he was not adjusting well to an environment where manipulation and charm had no currency. The other inmates apparently had little patience for men who preyed on elderly women and single mothers. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it finally arrives, it's worth the wait. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just protecting yourself. It's making sure the predator never gets the chance to hurt anyone else again. I raised my evening tea in a quiet toast to the woman I'd become, to the choices that had protected my family, and to the knowledge that some grandmothers are far more dangerous than they appear to innocent eyes. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.